Welcome to History Unveiled, where the secrets of the past come alive. In today's episode, we unravel the mystery surrounding the death of Edward VI, the only son of Henry VIII. Was it illness, murder, or manipulation? Join us as we reveal the truth behind this royal enigma. The truth behind Henry VIII's spoiled son's death, uncovering Edward VI's final days. Part 1. The Heir Born of Obsession. Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of a male heir was not merely a personal obsession. It was a national priority. England in the early 16th century was a kingdom anxious about stability, where the lack of a clear male successor could mean civil war. Henry's previous marriages, first to Catherine of Aragon, then to Anne Boleyn, had failed to provide the longed-for son who would secure the Tudor legacy. Catherine had given birth to Mary, and had produced Elizabeth, but both were female. And in the patriarchal mindset of the time, a woman on the throne was synonymous with weakness and vulnerability. When Jane Seymour gave birth to a son on October 12, 1537, the jubilation at court was immediate and overwhelming. The infant was christened Edward, named after Edward the Confessor, signaling divine favor and historic continuity. But that joy was soon tempered by tragedy. Jane Seymour died less than 2 weeks after childbirth, likely from puerperal fever. Edward, now the heir to the throne, was left without a mother, an ominous start to a life destined to carry the hopes of an entire kingdom. From the beginning, Edward was surrounded by overprotectiveness disguised as reverence. His early life was confined to carefully managed royal nurseries with strict protocols. Contact with others was limited, and every decision regarding his upbringing was deeply political. The court feared disease, contamination, or even potential harm from overzealous courtiers. This isolation, while meant to protect him, may have inadvertently stunted his resilience. Accounts from royal attendants described Edward as bright, obedient, and precocious. He quickly learned Latin, Greek, and even some theology, showing an unusual level of intellect for his age. Yet there were quiet murmurs, even in those early years, of his delicate constitution. He suffered frequent fevers, coughs, and skin infections. Tudor medicine, still rooted in humoral theory, lacked both the diagnostic clarity and curative power to manage long-term or systemic illness. The king himself, though initially pleased with his son's academic growth, became worried about the child's frailty. Henry VIII, in his later years, had grown immensely paranoid about securing his legacy. He would insist upon strict medical regimens, ensuring his son had the finest physicians and apothecaries. Yet many of these remedies were little more than herbal potions or aggressive purgatives, potentially doing more harm than good. Some records even suggest Edward was subjected to bleeding, a dangerous practice for a child with a weak immune system. More than just a son, Edward represented an ideology. He was the living symbol of divine favor and Protestant succession. With the break from Rome and the establishment of the Church of England, Henry saw Edward as the God-ordained vessel for his religious reforms. This placed immense pressure on a boy not yet old enough to understand his own destiny. From birth, Edward's life was orchestrated not for personal well-being, but for national propaganda. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was only 9 years old. He ascended the throne as Edward VI, but power was placed in the hands of regents and protectors. Many saw in him a new Josiah, a boy king destined to purify England's church and steer it toward a Protestant utopia. This vision, while grand, rested on a fragile foundation, the health and vitality of a sickly child. The cracks, although hidden behind layers of ceremony and hope, had already begun to form. Edward's birth had been hailed as a miracle, the answer to Henry's desperate prayers. But that miracle came wrapped in uncertainty, vulnerability, and the weight of dynastic pressure that would shadow him until his final breath. Part 2. A sickly prince from the start. From the earliest years of Edward VI's life, careful observers noted signs that all was not well with the king's only legitimate son. Though the Tudor court rejoiced in the birth of a male heir, those who tended to Edward behind the scenes whispered of a child whose health never quite matched his royal promise. Royal nurses and physicians, in their preserved correspondence, described a boy frequently afflicted with fevers, chills, and episodes of respiratory distress. Even his physical appearance, pale, slender, and often fatigued, led some to worry, though such fears were never aired openly for fear of offending the king. Unlike his robust father, Edward did not grow into the hardy frame or energetic spirit Henry VIII so admired in men. While his intelligence was unquestionable and his obedience praised, he lacked the physical resilience expected of a Tudor monarch. This delicate constitution led to constant medical interventions, most of which were rooted in the flawed understandings of Tudor medicine. Treatments for childhood illnesses often included purging, bloodletting, and herbal concoctions designed to rebalance the humors, a theory still dominant at the time. In practice, these procedures often weakened the patient rather than cured him. His diet was controlled, his exposure to the elements was limited, and his activities were monitored with unrelenting caution. Royal protectors created a lifestyle that placed safety over stimulation, health over experience. And yet, despite this regimen of care, Edward continued to suffer recurring illnesses. Accounts of lingering coughs, skin rashes, nosebleeds, and exhaustion punctuated his childhood. These symptoms, though dismissed publicly as the natural fragility of youth, increasingly raised alarm among the inner circle of courtiers. Modern historians have attempted to match these early symptoms with possible diagnoses. Some suggest Edward may have had a congenital condition, such as an inherited immune deficiency or a chronic respiratory illness, like bronchiectasis. Others propose he may have contracted tuberculosis in early childhood, a disease that would have gradually worsened over time while remaining largely undetectable to Tudor physicians. The disease, known at the time as consumption, often progressed slowly, its early signs misinterpreted as growing pains or minor colds. Edward's regular bouts of illness may well have been early signals of something far more lethal. Despite this, the political necessity of appearing strong meant that no official record ever publicly acknowledged his sickliness. Portraits depicted Edward as glowing with youthful health, his cheeks rosy, his posture straight, his gaze noble and self-assured. Such images were crafted not to reflect reality, but to inspire confidence in the future of the Tudor dynasty. In reality, Edward was a boy carefully managed, often confined to indoor life, and always at the mercy of court physicians whose methods now seem dangerously misguided. The pressure to protect Edward also extended to who was allowed near him. His companions were selected based on health, loyalty, and Protestant leanings. Any servant or tutor who displayed symptoms of illness was swiftly removed from his household. This constant monitoring may have isolated Edward socially, depriving him of the robust immune resistance gained from interaction with peers. Ironically, the court's efforts to shield the boy from harm may have increased his susceptibility to disease. By the time Edward reached the age of 7 or 8, these concerns were becoming harder to hide. Though he continued to receive praise for his intellect and discipline, observers such as foreign ambassadors noted his pale complexion and slight frame. Rumors, though never printed or formally recorded, swirled in diplomatic reports about his health. Some speculated that the king might not live to adulthood, a terrifying possibility for a nation that had only just escaped the Wars of the Roses a few decades earlier. Still, Edward's condition was treated as manageable, perhaps because it had to be. The deeper truth, however, was that Edward's health was already on a fragile edge. The court might have controlled his diet, his tutors, and his medicine, but they could not change the fact that England's future rested on a boy who coughed too much, tired too quickly, and could not be exposed to the world beyond his guarded chambers. Even as he smiled for his painted portraits and penned essays on religion and kingship, Edward VI was a boy whose body was struggling to bear the weight of his crown. Part 3. The Shadow of Tuberculosis. As the symptoms surrounding Edward VI's condition worsened over the years, one chilling possibility began to emerge from historical records: tuberculosis, or as it was known then, consumption. This disease was common and deadly in Tudor England, especially among the young, and those confined in poorly ventilated rooms. For Edward, who lived a highly protected yet strangely unhealthy life, tuberculosis was not only plausible, it was increasingly probable. Though it was not diagnosed in his lifetime, modern historians and medical scholars have revisited the descriptions of his final months and found striking similarities to the classic signs of the disease. Tuberculosis typically develops slowly, often beginning with an intermittent cough, fatigue, and slight fevers. Over time, it progresses to night sweats, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and dramatic weight loss. Edward exhibited all these symptoms in his last 2 years. Reports from court chroniclers speak of a young king who could no longer ride horses, whose voice weakened, and who developed a persistent cough that no remedy could silence. By early 1553, he was coughing up blood, a nearly definitive symptom of pulmonary tuberculosis. Those close to Edward, such as Sir Thomas Wotton and Ambassador Jahan Sheaf, observed how his complexion faded and how his frame grew thin and wasted. They noted that he continued to decline despite numerous medical interventions, and that no amount of rest, tonics, or prayer improved his condition. One French report claimed he was wasting away daily, language that in hindsight unmistakably points to a tubercular decline. Still, within the court, the idea of tuberculosis was never mentioned explicitly. To do so would have been to admit that the future of England was in the grip of a fatal illness. There is also a geographical and environmental angle to consider. Tuberculosis thrived in damp, crowded places, and although Edward lived in palaces, his chambers, especially during cold winters, were often poorly ventilated and cloaked in heavy draperies to keep out drafts. These rooms, closed off to fresh air and sunlight, were ideal conditions for the bacteria to flourish. Combine that with his lack of physical activity, a tightly controlled diet, and minimal exposure to the outdoors, and Edward's body may have been the perfect host for such an affliction. One of the tragedies of Tudor medicine was its complete inability to understand infectious disease. The concept of germs and bacterial contagion would not emerge until centuries later. Instead, physicians based treatments on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Edward was likely bled, purged, or subjected to mustard plasters, treatments that would have only further weakened his immune system. In trying to save him, they may have hastened his decline. By early 1553, Edward was no longer attending council meetings and was rarely seen in public. When he did appear, he looked gaunt, his face sunken, his body frail. Contemporaries noted how his appearance shocked those who had not seen him for several months. His decline could no longer be hidden behind state propaganda or optimistic bulletins from his physicians. The young king was wasting away, and everyone at court knew it, even if they dared not speak it aloud. Had tuberculosis been understood then, as it is today, there might have been hope through isolation and improved hygiene, though even modern medicine struggled with the disease until antibiotics were developed in the 20th century. For Edward, in 1553, there was no cure, only pain management and blind hope. His every breath was a struggle, and his mind, once so sharp, was gradually overtaken by exhaustion. Still, even as his body failed him, he insisted on continuing his role as king, dictating letters and finalizing his views on succession. It was as if he knew his time was short and that every moment had to count. Edward's deterioration under the shadow of tuberculosis marked not only the end of a young life, but the collapse of a political experiment. He had been the great Protestant hope, the boy king meant to secure a reformed England. Instead, he became a ghost in his own court, the last breath of a dream that was dying before anyone could rescue it. Tuberculosis may not have been named at the time, but left fingerprints on every page of Edward's final chapter. And in those fading signs of life, history now reads a diagnosis that no Tudor physician could ever make. Part 4. Dangerous Treatments and Tudor Medicine. If Edward VI's symptoms pointed toward tuberculosis or a chronic underlying condition, the methods used to treat him may have done more harm than good. Tudor medicine, shaped by ancient theories and religious beliefs, operated in a world devoid of germ theory or modern diagnostics. Doctors relied heavily on the balancing of humors, a practice rooted in the works of Hippocrates and Galen, adapted to fit Christian ideology and royal superstition. For a sickly king like Edward, this meant enduring a cycle of invasive and exhausting remedies that further sapped his frail strength. Bleeding was among the most common of these treatments. Edward, like many of his contemporaries, was subjected to regular bloodletting, the belief being that excess blood could cause fevers and imbalance the body's health. Leeches or lancets would be applied to draw blood from his arms, legs, or neck, sometimes several times in a single week. In an already weakened state, these procedures could result in dizziness, fainting, or even infection. While intended to restore vitality, they often drain what little energy he had left. Another favored technique was purging, both upwards and downwards. Edward would have consumed mixtures designed to provoke vomiting or diarrhea with the aim of cleansing the body of supposed toxins. These concoctions, made from herbs like hellebore, senna, or rhubarb, were harsh, unpredictable, and debilitating. Repeated purging would have disrupted his digestion, led to dehydration, and weakened his immune response, making it harder for his body to fight off disease. In some cases, the purges were accompanied by enemas administered by royal physicians who believed bowel regulation was a cornerstone of health. Additionally, fumigations and aromatherapy were used in the king's chambers. Burning herbs such as rosemary, lavender, and frankincense was thought to cleanse the air of disease. While these scents may have offered a degree of comfort, they did nothing to halt the progression of a respiratory illness like tuberculosis. In fact, the thick smoke and heavy drapery in Edward's rooms may have worsened his breathing difficulties. Another significant concern was the use of mercury in certain treatments. Though not necessarily confirmed in Edward's case, mercury was a common ingredient in Tudor apothecary remedies, especially for treating impurities or skin issues. Mercury is highly toxic, and exposure through ointments or ingestion could cause neurological symptoms, digestive distress, and immune suppression. If Edward was exposed to such elements, as many royals were, his delicate condition would have deteriorated even more rapidly. The physicians themselves operated in a hierarchy, with the king's personal doctor often vying for prestige rather than effectiveness. Edward's court boasted learned men like Dr. Owen and Dr. Wendy, educated in Galenic theory and trained at prominent universities. Despite their credentials, they were trapped in a medical tradition that prized appearance and ritual over results. The fear of losing favor with the crown meant that physicians rarely admitted failure or incompetence. Instead, they would prescribe increasingly aggressive treatments, convinced that inactivity risked disgrace more than error did. There was also political pressure to keep Edward alive, not just for his own sake, but for the Protestant Reformation that had taken root under his rule. His counselors, particularly the Duke of Northumberland, needed Edward to project strength and continuity. Thus, his medical condition was shrouded in secrecy, and even his physicians were discouraged from giving clear assessments of his health. This atmosphere made it nearly impossible to alter his treatment plan, even when it became clear that nothing was working. Ironically, Edward's intelligence and curiosity may have made things worse. He studied classical texts, including medical writings, and took an interest in how his body was being treated. This meant he may have accepted or even requested treatments based on flawed theories, believing them to be part of his kingly duty to seek healing through wisdom. Entrusting the traditions of his tutors and healers, he allowed the cycle of harmful interventions to continue uninterrupted. The image of Edward suffering quietly under these procedures is a haunting one. A boy king barely in his teens, subjected to leeches, purgatives, and smoke while trying to fulfill a destiny shaped by others. He was not merely a patient but a symbol of health, of hope, and of the future of England. And every decision made about his body was shaped not only by medical ignorance, but by the heavy expectations of a crumbling dynasty. In the end, the very hands meant to heal him may have helped hasten his death, one misguided treatment at a time. Part 5. The political weight of a dying king. As Edward VI's health slipped further into visible decline, the focus of the Tudor court shifted from medicine to politics. For many of those surrounding the king, particularly the powerful Duke of Northumberland, Edward's survival was not simply a matter of personal concern, it was a matter of regime survival. With the young king's Protestant reforms barely rooted and no clear male heir to succeed him, the stakes surrounding Edward's every breath grew immeasurably high. By early 1553, Edward was clearly not long for the world. Yet public admissions of his condition were rare, even discouraged. The illusion of stability had to be maintained for the sake of both domestic order and international diplomacy. England's foreign enemies, particularly the Catholic powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire, watched closely for any sign of instability. If Edward died and a Catholic heir like Mary Tudor took the throne, the religious reformation he championed could be rapidly reversed. This placed a nearly unbearable burden on Edward himself. Even as his health waned, he remained engaged in matters of state, largely through written correspondence and occasional appearances before his Privy Council. His education and natural curiosity had produced a precocious ruler, one who understood law, religion, and political theory better than many adults twice his age. But despite his intellect, he was still a child battling a wasting illness, with little understanding of the political maneuvering forming behind his back. Chief among the architects of that maneuvering was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. As Edward's chief minister, Northumberland had every reason to fear what would happen if the king died prematurely. Mary, Edward's half-sister and Henry VIII's eldest daughter, stood next in line to inherit the throne under the Third Succession Act. However, she was a devout Catholic. Her accession would undo Northumberland's reforms, endanger his life, and undo the Protestant establishment Edward had worked to build. This was why, during the spring of 1553, Edward, though visibly ill, began drafting what would later be known as the Devise for the Succession. It was a radical departure from existing law, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's Protestant daughter-in-law. Whether this plan was entirely Edward's idea or heavily shaped by Northumberland remains debated. But the timing of the document, drafted while Edward was clearly dying, strongly suggests political coercion, or at the very least, strategic influence. The devise was cloaked in religious justification. Edward argued that Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate during their father's reign. But the deeper reasoning was the desire to preserve Protestantism, which Edward believed was England's divine path. He saw Mary's Catholicism as heresy and a threat to the soul of the realm. By naming Jane Grey as his successor, he hoped to preserve God's work through political means, even if it broke established law. Yet not everyone agreed. Some members of the Privy Council, including Edward's former tutors and advisors, were deeply uneasy about bypassing the rightful heirs. But speaking against a devise meant challenging not only the king but also Northumberland, who by then controlled the royal guard, access to Edward, and even the flow of information out of court. In this climate of fear and manipulation, many signed the document with silent reluctance. Edward, for his part, seems to have believed deeply in what he was doing. In his eyes, this was not just a legal maneuver, it was a sacred act to save England's soul. Even as he coughed up blood and weakened further, he pressed forward, insisting that all key figures agree to the plan before his death. By June 1553, with his body failing rapidly, Edward pushed his council to have the devise finalized and legally enforced. His desperation was not just physical, it was theological and political. Yet despite all this urgency, time was not on Edward's side. He would not live to see how the devise played out. But the very existence of the document and the decisions made around it had profound implications. It sparked one of the most tragic episodes in Tudor history, the brief, doomed reign of Lady Jane Grey, followed by Mary Tudor's bloody rise to power. Edward VI's final months were a devastating blend of physical suffering and political turmoil. He was a dying child with the weight of a kingdom and a religion on his shoulders. Though still a boy, he made decisions that would ignite rebellions, cost lives, and reshape the monarchy. His illness was not just a private tragedy, it was a national crisis cloaked in royal silence and desperate schemes. And as his young body declined, the world around him prepared for the storm that would follow his final breath. Part 6. Conflicting Accounts and Eyewitness Testimonies. In the wake of Edward VI's death, a torrent of conflicting testimonies emerged from courtiers, physicians, foreign ambassadors, and servants, each attempting to explain, justify, or obscure what had happened in those final weeks inside the king's private chambers. Some of these accounts were shaped by genuine concern or personal grief. Others, however, were steeped in politics, rumor, or self-preservation. The result was a tangled web of narratives that has made the truth behind Edward's final illness elusive for historians ever since. One of the earliest accounts came from Sir Henry VIII, a courtier and close companion of Edward's. Sidney was reportedly present in the final days and even slept in the king's chamber during moments of intense decline. His later reflections, preserved in family records, describe a young king in continual prayer, clinging to his Protestant faith until the very end. He depicted Edward as resigned to death but spiritually calm, offering a vision of royal dignity and divine favor. Yet this emotional image conflicts with more clinical, troubling descriptions by medical staff and diplomats. The imperial ambassador, Jean Sheaffe, offered a very different portrayal in letters sent to the Holy Roman Emperor. Sheaffe wrote that Edward's body was racked with violent coughing, his skin had turned blue in places, and he had developed swellings that suggested serious internal infection or organ failure. He claimed the boy king could no longer walk or eat solid food in the final weeks and was rarely coherent when he did speak. Sheaffe also alluded to the presence of strange treatments, though he avoided naming specific methods, possibly out of diplomatic caution. Then came the testimonies of the royal physicians themselves. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had long served the Tudors, insisted that Edward's illness was natural and long-lasting. He pointed to a chronic lung condition, likely tuberculosis, exacerbated by the rigors of royal duty and repeated treatments that failed to halt the infection spread. Yet Wendy's comments, made after Mary Tudor came to power, were notably careful, likely aimed at distancing himself from any suspicion of malpractice or political bias. Adding further confusion were the reports of swelling in Edward's legs and stomach. Some observers took this as a sign of poisoning rather than pulmonary disease. Sir John Harington later noted that Edward's body was so puffed and altered that it bore little resemblance to the boy he had once known. This led to whispered accusations, circulating quietly in court and more loudly among foreign observers, that the king may have been deliberately poisoned to make way for a new regime. The identity of the potential poisoners, however, changed depending on the storyteller's loyalties. Protestants pointed fingers at Catholic sympathizers who allegedly feared Edward's plans to make Protestantism permanent. Catholics, on the other hand, hinted that Northumberland himself may have hastened the boy's death to bring Jane Grey to power sooner. Even some of Edward's old tutors, like Sir John Cheek, would later admit to confusion and dismay at the swirling rumors, stating that none knew truly what hand closed the door of his life. And yet, despite the many theories, no official investigation into Edward's death was ever conducted. Mary Tudor, once she became queen, had little interest in probing too deeply into her half-brother's demise. For her, Edward's death had cleared the path to the throne and, more importantly, allowed her to restore Catholic worship in England. She proclaimed national mourning, gave him a full state funeral, but quietly silenced most talk of illness or conspiracy. This royal silence did nothing to suppress speculation. It merely redirected it underground, where it continued to grow and mutate for decades. Interestingly, the chronicles of the day also differ on when exactly Edward realized he was dying. Some reports suggest he remained hopeful until the very last week, asking when he might ride again or attend council. Others describe a boy who had made peace with his fate far earlier, focused on prayer, scripture, and ensuring the succession plan he endorsed would hold firm. The truth may lie somewhere between, a young king slowly understanding that despite his title, he could not command his body to heal. One final account stands out, written by a servant who claimed to have overheard Edward weeping at night, not for himself, but for England's future. He reportedly whispered verses from the Book of Psalms and clutched a small crucifix, asking God to safeguard the true faith after his passing. Whether this image is historical fact or crafted memory, it reflects the profound weight that Edward carried in life and in death. Even in his final hours, he was not merely a child dying of illness, he was a symbol of a religious war still far from over. The chaos of conflicting reports, medical contradictions, and political silence leaves us today with no definitive answer about Edward's end. But within those fragments, those whispered observations, guarded letters, and tear-streaked recollections, we catch glimpses of a dying boy at the heart of a kingdom in flux. And while no single account can claim the full truth, together they tell a deeper story of Tudor fear, faith, and fragile power. Part 7. The Mysterious Symptoms. What was killing Edward? The death of Edward VI at just 15 years old was a devastating moment for Tudor England, but it also raised immediate medical questions that have persisted for centuries. What exactly was the disease that brought down the seemingly bright, intelligent, and once healthy heir to Henry VIII? His symptoms were recorded, sporadically and often contradictorily, by various witnesses, but these fragmentary notes paint a picture far more complex than a single, clear diagnosis. One of the most consistent details concerns Edward's persistent, racking cough. Chronic and worsening over the course of several months, this cough was often accompanied by fevers, night sweats, and a rapid decline in weight. These symptoms suggest a respiratory infection, and historians and physicians alike have long speculated that Edward likely suffered from pulmonary tuberculosis, also known as consumption. This disease, common and often fatal in the 16th century, was notorious for its slow erosion of the lungs and ability to mimic other illnesses. However, tuberculosis alone might not account for all the symptoms that emerge in Edward's final months. Contemporary reports mention his limbs swelling significantly, his fingers and toes turning blue or black, and his face becoming discolored, signs not typical of simple consumption. These details hint at possible secondary complications such as septicemia or kidney failure, both of which could occur as tuberculosis advanced and infected other parts of the body. In Edward's time, there were no antibiotics or reliable treatments for such conditions. Once they took hold, death was almost inevitable. The court physicians, however, were not in agreement even then. Different practitioners offered a range of explanations, from an imposthume on the lung, a type of abscess, to consumption of the spirits, a vague term often used when exact causes were unknown. Some believe that Edward's condition was not primarily respiratory at all, instead pointing to problems with his digestive tract, particularly when reports noted the king was vomiting black substances and could not retain food. This has led some modern scholars to propose that Edward may have been suffering from Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, complicated by infection. Yet these ideas are necessarily speculative, based on partial evidence and incomplete documentation. No autopsy was conducted on the king's body, and no medical notes survive in full from the physicians who treated him during his decline. What we are left with are ambiguous symptoms: a persistent cough, high fevers, emaciation, swelling of extremities, vomiting, discoloration, and intense pain. Another theory that has gained attention in recent decades is that Edward died not from a disease alone, but from medical mistreatment. The Tudor court, like much of 16th century Europe, practiced aggressive interventions that often worsened the patient's condition. Bleeding was one such common treatment, used to balance the body's humors. If Edward was bled repeatedly, as many royal patients were, it may have weakened him irreparably or led to hypovolemic shock. Additionally, some historians suspect that Edward was administered mercury-based treatments, especially if syphilis or other infections were mistakenly suspected. Mercury, though sometimes used in small doses for certain ailments, could be highly toxic and would only exacerbate organ failure if administered over time. The line between cure and poison was thin, especially in an age when medical understanding was still deeply rooted in ancient, often incorrect theories. Of course, one cannot ignore the elephant in the room: poison. Many at court and abroad speculated that Edward may have been deliberately poisoned, though definitive proof has never emerged. Yet if someone were slowly poisoning him with arsenic or other toxins over time, it might produce symptoms not unlike those described: fatigue, wasting, abdominal pain, vomiting, swelling, and discoloration. In that sense, poisoning could either mimic tuberculosis or be masked by it, complicating any effort to determine a single cause of death. The lack of a consistent narrative about Edward's condition may ultimately be due to one simple reality: he likely suffered from multiple overlapping illnesses or conditions. A primary infection such as tuberculosis may have weakened his immune system, leaving him vulnerable to opportunistic infections, poor medical treatment, or complications from the very remedies meant to save him. His youth and the pressures of kingship would have made recovery even less likely. What makes Edward's case so perplexing is not just the ambiguity of symptoms, but the political silence that followed his death. Had he been a lesser royal or a nobleman, an inquiry might have followed, if only to apportion blame. But with the throne changing hands so quickly and religious conflict erupting between Protestants and Catholics, there was little appetite to open a medical investigation that could expose political scandal or error. In the end, Edward VI's death remains a medical mystery, suspended in a fog of 16th century superstition, flawed practice, and political distraction. His symptoms, though partially recorded, never coalesce into a definitive diagnosis, and every plausible theory leaves troubling questions unanswered. Was it tuberculosis, septicemia, a botched treatment, or something more sinister? We may never know with certainty what disease killed England's last true Tudor prince. But the nature of his symptoms and the lack of clarity only deepens the tragedy of a young life cut short by forces neither he nor his doctors could fully understand. Part 8. Silence in the Court. Why Edward's death was quickly buried. The death of a monarch is rarely a quiet affair, especially when that monarch is a young king whose rule represents the continuity of a powerful dynasty. Yet strangely, the death of Edward VI in July 1553 was marked not by widespread mourning or elaborate public ceremony, but by an atmosphere of eerie restraint. While whispers echoed through the streets of London, the official court response was almost shockingly subdued. This silence, this almost calculated quiet, has prompted many historians to ask a haunting question. Why did the English court seem so eager to bury not just the body of Edward VI, but the very fact of his death? From the highest counselors to the palace physicians, there appeared to be a deliberate effort to obscure the truth and suppress any rumors that might destabilize the kingdom. At the heart of this suppression was fear. Edward VI's death left the Tudor succession in peril. Although Henry VIII had clearly named his daughters Mary and Elizabeth as heirs should Edward die without issue, Edward himself, under pressure or perhaps in full agency, had sought to alter that arrangement shortly before his death. He drafted the controversial devise for the succession, naming Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his chosen successor. But when Edward died on July 6, 1553, this document had not been officially passed by Parliament. Legally and publicly, the rightful heir remained Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, a staunch Catholic. The Protestant elite surrounding Edward, men like the Duke of Northumberland, knew they were on precarious ground. If Mary were informed immediately of Edward's death, she would rally supporters and claim her throne. Thus, the first step in the plan to install Lady Jane Grey was to delay the news of Edward's passing. For nearly 2 full days, Edward's death was concealed from the public. Only a small inner circle of courtiers and politicians were informed, and they worked swiftly to consolidate their hold on power before making any announcements. During this time, proclamations were drafted, troops were moved, and Jane was summoned to Sion House under the pretense of a family visit. When the death was finally acknowledged on July 8th, it was presented in the context of Lady Jane's rise. Rather than focusing on national mourning or the commemoration of Edward's reign, the message from the Privy Council emphasized the need to secure the Protestant succession and prevent a return to Catholicism under Mary. In effect, Edward's death was used not as a moment for reflection or ceremony, but as a political stepping stone. His funeral, too, was unusually muted for a reigning monarch. It did not take place until a full month later, on August 8th, and even then, the funeral procession was far less grand than those of his predecessors. There was no lying in state, no elaborate public viewing, and minimal pageantry. The service was held at Westminster Abbey and followed Protestant rites, marking it as England's first royal funeral under the new faith. Yet even here, the ceremony was as much about sending a political message as it was about honoring the dead king. The eulogy emphasized Edward's piety and commitment to religious reform, subtly reinforcing the idea that his true legacy lay in his faith, not in his royal blood. In doing so, the service was designed to justify the selection of Lady Jane, a fellow Protestant, rather than Mary, a Catholic by conviction and practice. Contemporary chroniclers noted the strangeness of this quiet funeral. In an age where monarchs were mourned with weeping processions, street bonfires, and mourning garments worn across the land, Edward's funeral passed with barely a ripple among the populace. This lack of collective grief may not have reflected public indifference, but rather public confusion or even deliberate restriction of expression. Indeed, the government had likely feared that any widespread mourning could lead to unrest. Edward was deeply popular among England's Protestants, and many viewed him as a child king chosen by God to lead a new religious age. His sudden death and replacement by the virtually unknown Jane Grey was bound to spark suspicion and anger if not carefully managed. Silence then became the safest strategy, both for control and survival. This calculated muting of Edward's death left an impression that would linger for centuries. It contributed to the aura of mystery surrounding his final days and raised further questions about what the court was so desperate to hide. Was it merely political maneuvering, or was there something darker beneath the surface? A royal death that should have prompted national mourning became instead a well-managed disappearance from history's center stage. In the end, Edward's passing was overshadowed by the chaos that followed. The 9-day reign of Jane Grey, the dramatic rise of Mary I, and the brutal executions that ensued would soon consume the nation's attention. But the quiet that surrounded Edward's death, unnatural, restrained, and deliberate, continues to whisper its own secrets, as if history itself was told to keep its voice down. Part 9. The Shadow of Jane Grey, Political Fallout and Edward's Legacy. When Edward VI died in July 1553, his vision for England did not die with him. Instead, it triggered a political firestorm that would shape the future of the Tudor dynasty and determine the religious fate of the nation. At the heart of this turmoil stood Lady Jane Grey, the frail yet fiercely intelligent teenager suddenly declared Queen of England. Jane's claim to the throne was directly tied to Edward's dying wishes. His devise for the succession, hastily written in the final months of his life, excluded his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth and passed the crown instead to the male heirs of Lady Frances Grey, later amended to include Jane herself. This document, despite its personal and religious motivations, lacked parliamentary approval and legal authority. Edward had grown increasingly concerned that his efforts to reform the Church of England might be undone by Mary, a committed Catholic, He believed Jane, his cousin and a devout Protestant, would continue the transformation of the English Church. Whether this decision was made independently or under the influence of powerful advisors, such as the Duke of Northumberland, remains a matter of historical debate. Northumberland, head of Edward's council and father-in-law to Jane, had a clear interest in preserving Protestant control and his own political dominance. By elevating Jane, he hoped to avoid both Mary's Catholic restoration and Elizabeth's unpredictable loyalties. As Edward weakened, Northumberland tightened his grip on court affairs, orchestrating Jane's marriage to his son Guilford Dudley and preparing for a rapid transition of power. Yet the plan faltered almost immediately. Although Edward's death was kept secret for 2 days, the public did not accept Jane's succession when it was announced. Mary, rallying Catholic and traditionalist support in East Anglia, gained momentum quickly. Messages of loyalty poured in from nobles, military leaders, and foreign powers who recognized her as Henry VIII's rightful heir. As Jane was proclaimed queen on July 10th, Mary was already gathering troops. In a dramatic reversal of fortune, the Privy Council abandoned Jane within 9 days and proclaimed Mary as queen. Northumberland was arrested and later executed, along with key supporters who had tried to secure Edward's Protestant legacy through Jane. This short-lived reign had lasting consequences. Although Jane was only a political pawn, her execution in February 1554 came to symbolize both the tragic cost of political ambition and the fragility of Edward's final plans. Edward had hoped to secure religious continuity, but his decision plunged the country into deeper conflict. Mary's accession reversed Edward's reforms almost overnight. She reinstated papal authority, outlawed Protestant practices, and sought to purge the nation of heresy. Many of Edward's closest advisors were imprisoned, executed, or driven into exile. His liturgical changes were revoked, and his Book of Common Prayer was banned. The memory of Edward, once celebrated as the godly boy king, became entangled with the failed Jane experiment. For Catholic historians, he became a misguided tool of zealous reformers. For Protestants in exile or rebellion, he remained a martyred prince whose vision had been crushed by tyranny. Even in death, Edward's shadow continued to loom over English politics. His legacy became a rallying cry for Protestants during Mary's reign and influenced Elizabeth I when she later came to the throne. Elizabeth inherited not just the kingdom, but the complex religious landscape Edward had tried to shape. Edward VI was not simply a sickly boy monarch who died too soon. His choices, writings, and ideals created ripples that defined an era. His attempt to control the future from his deathbed may have failed in the short term, but ensured that his influence outlived the brief flame of his reign. Part 10. The Mysterious Symptoms: What Really Killed Edward VI. Edward VI's death has baffled historians for centuries. Unlike his father's highly public and protracted decline, Edward's final illness was shrouded in secrecy, confusion, and inconsistent accounts. Despite the best efforts of royal physicians, the precise nature of the disease that killed the 15-year-old king remains a topic of intense debate. So, what exactly were Edward's symptoms, and what do they reveal about the cause of his untimely demise? Contemporary sources describe Edward as wasting away, his body becoming emaciated, his strength failing. Reports note a persistent and racking cough, shortness of breath, and frequent fevers. His skin reportedly turned pallid, his eyes sunk into his face, and there were troubling signs of discoloration in his extremities. He also suffered from swelling in his legs and abdomen, along with episodes of diarrhea and exhaustion. Some of these symptoms strongly resemble tuberculosis, then called consumption, a common and deadly disease in Tudor England. Tuberculosis was known to cause coughing, fever, night sweats, and dramatic weight loss. It often attacked the lungs but could also affect other organs, particularly in its advanced stages. The prolonged nature of Edward's illness, roughly 6 months of steady decline, fits the pattern of pulmonary tuberculosis. However, not all historians agree with this diagnosis. The presence of swelling in the legs and abdomen has led others to consider kidney failure or even Hodgkin's lymphoma as possibilities. In Edward's case, some symptoms such as facial flushing and persistent infection could point to a more complex, systemic illness. His physicians prescribed purges and bleedings, standard Tudor treatments, which may have worsened his condition rather than helping it. There's also speculation about arsenic poisoning, whether accidental or deliberate. Arsenic exposure can cause skin discoloration, severe gastrointestinal symptoms, and organ failure. Some accounts suggest that Edward's hair became brittle and fell out, a possible indicator of poisoning. However, no hard forensic evidence exists to confirm this theory, and it remains largely speculative. The royal doctors themselves seemed confused. One early diagnosis was measles, then changed to smallpox, then scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes. As Edward's health declined in spring 1553, doctors began keeping detailed records, noting his worsening cough, high fevers, and labored breathing. They also recorded his difficulty speaking and his growing sense of doom, which suggests the illness was affecting his mental clarity as well. Remarkably, Edward himself seemed aware he was dying. He recorded his condition in his personal writings, describing his worsening symptoms with a mixture of calm and resignation. In the final weeks, he became too weak to write, relying instead on whisper instructions and signs. One servant wrote that he faded like a candle in the wind, a poignant metaphor for the final days of a boy king. Post-mortem rumors spread quickly, as they often did in Tudor England. Some whispered that Edward had been poisoned to clear the path for Mary. Others believed divine punishment had struck him down for his aggressive Protestant reforms. Yet others saw his death as a simple tragedy of nature, a cruel twist of fate that robbed England of a promising young monarch. Modern medical experts, working from historical descriptions, tend to support tuberculosis as the most plausible cause of death. It fits the duration, the progression, and the visible symptoms, particularly the coughing, weight loss, and fatigue. But because Edward's body was never examined with modern tools and no tissue samples exist, the truth may never be known with certainty. What remains clear is that Edward's death was not sudden. It was drawn out, painful, and visible to those around him. As he declined, the court's attention quietly shifted to succession planning, and the people of England were kept in the dark. By the time the death was announced in July 1553, the political machinery for Jane Grey's elevation was already in motion. In this sense, the mystery of Edward's illness is not just a medical question. It is also a political one, cloaked in fear, secrecy, and urgency. The dying boy king, fading away behind palace walls, was more than just a victim of disease. He was the center of a national crisis, his body becoming the battleground on which England's future would be fought. Part 11. The Physicians and the Palace, Tudor Medicine in Crisis. As Edward VI's health declined, the physicians of the Tudor court found themselves at the center of a desperate and ultimately futile effort to save the king's life. Medicine in the mid-16th century was still rooted in ancient theories, dominated by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, it was believed, stemmed from an imbalance of these humors, and the remedies were as dangerous as the diseases they attempted to treat. In Edward's final months, these outdated practices may have hastened his demise rather than prevented it. Edward's chief physician was Sir Thomas Wendy, a trusted servant of the crown who had also served Henry VIII in his final days. Wendy was joined by other notable medical men, including Dr. Owen, Dr. Bill, and the Italian physician Dr. Ferdinando. This team, while experienced by Tudor standards, had no understanding of infection, immunity, or germ theory. Instead, they focused on purges, bloodletting, herbal tonics, and prayers, the best the age could offer, but entirely ineffective against tuberculosis or cancer. Purging was a common treatment Edward received. Physicians believed that forcing the body to vomit or defecate would rid it of harmful substances and restore balance. Accounts describe Edward being subjected to repeated purges and enemas, which left him weakened, dehydrated, and vulnerable to secondary infections. He was also bled, a procedure where leeches or incisions drained blood to relieve excess heat or humoral imbalance. In hindsight, these treatments likely contributed to his rapid deterioration. The loss of fluids and nutrients, combined with the emotional toll of chronic illness, wore down a body already under siege from disease. Modern physicians argue that these interventions could have accelerated heart failure or kidney collapse, hastening the king's death. But at the time, such actions were seen as signs of diligent care, not recklessness. Despite their efforts, the physicians could not agree on a single diagnosis. Some thought Edward was suffering from a childhood illness like measles or smallpox, while others feared a wasting disease or spiritual affliction. The disagreement may have stemmed from pressure at court. Diagnosing the king too quickly or pessimistically could lead to political repercussions. Even the act of reporting his worsening condition was fraught with risk, as factions at court fought to control the narrative. Physicians had to navigate not only illness but politics. The Duke of Northumberland, who dominated the court at the time, had a vested interest in Edward surviving long enough to secure Lady Jane Grey's succession. Any public admission of the king's terminal state might weaken Northumberland's position, incite Mary's supporters, or trigger unrest in London. Thus, the royal doctors walked a tightrope, expected to heal, advise, and reassure, all without revealing the truth of Edward's decline too soon. This veil of secrecy has hindered historical clarity ever since. Only sparse details from journals and private correspondence provide glimpses into the daily reality of the sick room. We know Edward's appetite failed, that he could no longer rise from bed, and that he had difficulty breathing and speaking in his final days. We also know his body was kept guarded after death, delaying the public funeral, as political negotiations played out behind palace doors. In the absence of a conclusive medical account, historians rely on circumstantial evidence and symptom patterns. The combination of fever, weight loss, chronic coughing, and slow deterioration points most strongly toward tuberculosis. But the question remains whether Edward could have survived longer had Tudor medicine not intervened so aggressively. It's a haunting thought that the very people charged with healing the king may have helped hasten his death, despite their best intentions. More broadly, Edward's death exposed the limitations of 16th century medicine at the highest levels of society. Even a king with access to the best doctors, the finest herbal remedies, and constant attention stood no real chance against serious illness. Without antibiotics, without diagnostic tools, without an understanding of contagion, Tudor medicine was as much performance as science. It offered comfort, ritual, and hope, but rarely a cure. Edward VI's physicians recorded their efforts with solemn precision. But behind the curtain of treatment lay a bitter truth: medicine could not save England's heir. And once the king's breath failed, their role ended, replaced by courtiers, soldiers, and politicians rushing to claim what was left of his kingdom. Part 12. The Succession Plot, securing Jane Grey's crown before Edward died. While King Edward VI slowly wasted away behind the guarded doors of Greenwich Palace, another battle was taking shape beyond his sickbed. This was not a contest of medicine or mortality, but of dynastic ambition and cold political maneuvering. As Edward's health declined, powerful men scrambled to reshape the line of succession, determined to keep the crown in Protestant hands. At the center of this scheme stood a young girl, Lady Jane Grey, and a dying boy king coerced into signing away his half-sister's rights. By law, Henry VIII had established a clear order of succession. Should Edward die without heirs, the crown would pass to Mary, his Catholic elder half-sister, and failing her, to Elizabeth, the younger Protestant half-sister. But for Edward and his Protestant council, Mary's accession posed a nightmare. She was a devout Catholic and had made no secret of her intention to restore papal authority and the old religion. The mastermind behind the plot to block Mary's path was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. As Edward's chief minister and father-in-law to Jane Grey, he stood to lose everything under a Catholic queen. He began maneuvering to secure his family's dominance by elevating Jane, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, to the throne. This plan required speed, secrecy, and above all, Edward's consent before he died. Edward, despite his worsening condition, was still mentally sharp. In early 1553, he began drafting a document known as the Devise for the Succession. This legal instrument bypassed Mary and Elizabeth entirely, naming Lady Jane Grey and her male heirs as successors. The original version allowed for Jane's male descendants only, but as Edward's health collapsed and no sons could possibly exist, it was altered to name Jane herself. Some historians argue Edward was pressured. Others believe he was fully committed to the plan, convinced that a Catholic monarch would undo his Protestant reforms. Either way, the teenage king, barely strong enough to sign his name, added his trembling signature to the devise. The Privy Council and leading judges, under immense pressure, were forced to approve the document, despite its questionable legality. Edward's cousin Jane was just 16 years old and had no idea what was being planned in her name. She was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's youngest sister, and had a royal bloodline, but no direct claim stronger than Mary or Elizabeth. Her strict Protestant upbringing and bookish nature made her the ideal puppet queen for Northumberland and his allies. All they needed was Edward to die, and for Mary to be kept in the dark until the plan was set in motion. Throughout the spring of 1553, preparations for the transition accelerated. Jane was married off to Northumberland's son, Guilford Dudley, in May, a move that further cemented the family's grip on power. Meanwhile, Edward's decline was hidden from the public, and even Mary was kept unaware of just how near her half-brother was to death. By early July, the final documents had been prepared, signed, and witnessed. Edward VI died on the evening of July 6, 1553. But his death was not immediately announced. Instead, Northumberland and the Privy Council worked quickly behind closed doors to secure the Tower of London, arm loyal forces, and summon Jane. On July 10th, Lady Jane Grey was publicly proclaimed Queen, ushered into the Tower as tradition demanded. What had been orchestrated as a seamless transfer of power quickly began to unravel. Mary, warned by allies, fled and began rallying support in East Anglia, proclaiming herself rightful queen in line with her father's will. The country soon split, not only over the legal technicalities, but over faith. Mary's Catholicism now became a rallying cry for many English subjects who saw Northumberland's plan as an illegal coup. The devise for the succession, once seen as Edward's last hope for Protestant England, would collapse within days of his death. Jane's reign lasted only 9 days, and by the end of July, Mary Tudor was declared queen. The boy king's final political act, his attempt to safeguard his religious legacy, failed almost as soon as he breathed his last. And in doing so, it cast Lady Jane Grey into a role she never sought, and ultimately, a tragic fate she could not escape. Part 13. The aftermath of Edward's death, reactions, rumors, and reversals. The death of King Edward VI in July 1553 sent a shockwave through the heart of England, not just because a monarch had died young, but because of the secrecy and uncertainty that surrounded it. For 6 days, the royal court concealed the king's passing, leaving London filled with whispers. When the news finally broke, the public reaction was a mix of confusion, fear, and suppressed sorrow. Edward, though young and relatively untested as a ruler, had symbolized Protestant hope to many, and his loss marked a turning point that few were prepared for. Immediately after Edward's death, the proclamation of Lady Jane Grey as queen was met with awkward silence from many corners of the kingdom. Though the announcement was made with all the royal ceremony expected, trumpets, processions, formal declarations, the crowds were not jubilant. Instead, there was hesitancy, even discontent. People knew that Mary Tudor had a stronger legal claim to the throne, and they also remembered Henry VIII's explicit wishes regarding the succession. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Edward had been poisoned by Catholic sympathizers who wanted Mary to rule. Others thought Northumberland had hastened the king's death to speed up his plan to place his daughter-in-law on the throne. There were whispers that Edward had died much earlier than announced, and that his body had been hidden while the coup was arranged. None of these claims were ever proven, but they added to the growing unease throughout the realm. At the heart of the tension was religion. Edward had pushed England further into Protestant reform than his father had ever dared, and many citizens feared Mary would reverse those changes. Still, loyalty to the Tudor bloodline and to Henry VIII's will held immense weight. When Mary raised her standard in East Anglia and issued proclamations denouncing Jane's claim as unlawful, her support grew rapidly. Cities like Norwich, Suffolk towns, and even parts of London began to declare for Mary. Meanwhile, in the Tower of London, Lady Jane Grey was an unwilling monarch under enormous pressure. She never participated in the succession plot, she was its tool. Northumberland's failure to anticipate the swift rise of support for Mary soon became apparent. As the Privy Council watched the tides turn, they began to switch allegiances behind closed doors, abandoning Jane to save themselves. By July 19th, just 13 days after Edward's death, Mary rode triumphantly into London, greeted by cheering crowds. The Privy Council declared her the rightful queen, and Jane was deposed without a single battle fought on her behalf. It was a peaceful transition on the surface, but beneath it lay months of political betrayal, religious division, and deep unrest. With Mary on the throne, the consequences of Edward's death became more sharply defined. One of her first acts was to imprison Northumberland and his closest allies. He was tried and executed, along with others who had engineered the succession plot. Jane, though initially spared, would remain in captivity, a living reminder of Protestant rebellion. Public reaction to these events was divided. Catholics celebrated Mary's accession as divine justice. Protestants mourned the reversal of Edward's reforms and feared persecution. In the churches, the English liturgy Edward had promoted was halted. Latin Mass was restored, and the visible signs of the Reformation began to vanish from the public eye. For the common people, the aftermath of Edward's death brought uncertainty and anxiety. The future direction of a nation was now in question, religiously, politically, and culturally. Would Mary rule with mercy or with vengeance? Would England return to the Pope, or could some middle ground be found? No one yet knew what Mary's England would look like. One thing, however, became increasingly clear. Edward VI's death was more than the end of a young king's life. It was the end of a Protestant dream hastily built on fragile ground. The hope that a boy king could secure a religious transformation proved tragically optimistic. And the plan to replace him with another Protestant ruler, conceived in desperation, had failed catastrophically. Even in death, Edward VI's legacy stirred division and danger. His short reign and the crisis that followed it would echo through English history, shaping everything that came next, from Mary's reign to the Elizabethan settlement. The truth behind his death, and the forces that try to bend it to their will, remain among the most poignant reminders of how fragile Tudor England really was. Part 14. Legacy of a Dying Boy, Edward VI and the Echoes of a Short Reign. Edward VI's reign was brief, his death premature, and his legacy deeply contested. Yet the impact of his rule and the crisis that followed it would shape England's destiny in ways no one at the time could fully predict. In life, Edward had sought to secure a Protestant future. In death, he became both a martyr to that cause and a symbol of political manipulation. The young king had come to the throne at 9, and by the time he died at 15, he had witnessed the machinations of 2 regencies, religious revolutions, economic unrest, and the constant threat of rebellion. Despite his youth, Edward left behind a remarkable imprint. He helped advance the Protestant Reformation far beyond what his father, Henry VIII, had dared. His Book of Common Prayer, his reforms to church doctrine, and his attempts to reshape royal succession showed a mind more active and involved than the figurehead many believe him to be. But Edward's legacy is inseparable from the drama that consumed England after his death. The devise for the succession, which bypassed his half-sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, revealed both his ideological convictions and the fragile foundation on which Tudor authority rested. He believed he was protecting England from the return of Catholicism. Instead, he triggered crisis that toppled a queen in 9 days, sparked widespread distrust, and ended with the executions of Northumberland, Jane Grey, and eventually many more under Mary I's reign. The suspicion surrounding Edward's death never fully dissipated. Though the consensus points to a slow decline from tuberculosis, whispers of foul play, poisoning, neglect, or even fabricated dates lingered in the minds of his contemporaries and later generations. Some suspected Mary's agents of hastening his end. Others blamed Northumberland, who gained most from a sudden vacancy of the throne. And still others questioned the ethics of a regime that concealed a king's death for nearly a week while they rushed to enact an illegal succession. In the years that followed, Edward's memory was reshaped according to the politics of the moment. To Protestant writers under Elizabeth I, he was remembered as a pure, reforming prince, a boy with the mind of a man, a saintly figure who died for his faith. To Catholic chroniclers, he was the product of misguided zeal, a puppet manipulated by greedy nobles and foreign ideas. Both narratives reveal more about the storytellers than the boy himself. Edward remains elusive, both known and unknowable, a monarch without precedent, and one without a true heir to carry out his vision. Mary Tudor, who succeeded him, would spend much of her reign reversing Edward's reforms. She returned England to Catholicism, re-established ties with Rome, and oversaw the Marian persecutions. Hundreds of Protestants were executed under her rule, an era that came to be known as the Burning Time. And yet, her reign too was short and marked by unrest. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, it was Edward's religious reforms, not Mary's, that would find a new champion. In a strange twist of history, Edward's death opened the door to the long and stable reign of his Protestant sister. Elizabeth I, who had been excluded from Edward's devise, would become the monarch who finally consolidated Protestantism in England. The Church of England, as it evolved under Elizabeth, bore the fingerprints of Edward's early reforms. The liturgies, the scriptures, the rejection of papal supremacy, these seeds, sown in Edward's brief reign, blossomed decades after his death. Even centuries later, Edward VI's life invites speculation and reassessment. Was he a visionary reformer or a pawn of ambitious men? Was his death natural, or did it serve the needs of those who benefited from his silence? And most importantly, what might England have become if Edward had lived another decade, married, and ruled in full maturity? History does not offer answers to these questions, only shadows and suggestions. What we do know is this: the death of Henry VIII's only son was more than a royal tragedy. It was a turning point in English history, a moment when ideology, illness, and ambition collided in a storm of uncertainty. Out of that storm came a queen who redefined a nation, a martyr who never sought the crown, and a boy king who tried to rewrite fate. Edward VI's short reign ended in silence, but its echoes still ring in the cathedrals, the politics, and the soul of modern Britain. And the truth behind his death, whether locked in his pale, frail body or in the vaults of Tudor secrecy, remains one of the great enigmas of royal history. Thanks for watching History Unveiled. If you enjoyed our deep dive into Edward VI's mysterious death, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Tudor history. Leave a comment with your theory. Until next time, keep questioning the past, because history always has more to tell.